Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
It was the kind of thing you hear once and never quite forget, no matter how many ways you try to write it off or excuse it away in the name of holiday stress or too many bourbons. My brother Ethan didn't yell it. He didn't whisper it with guilt or murmur it under his breath like maybe he'd regret it later. He looked me straight in the eye with the kind of calm, controlled cruelty that only comes from someone who has convinced themselves they're right and said, "No one wants you at Christmas this year." And the part that stuck with me, what kept ringing in my ears as I walked out his front door, was that I didn't argue. I just nodded, quiet, still. Then I went home and canceled the automatic payments I had been making on his mortgage for over a year. It had started off as something small. Ethan had asked for a tiny bridge loan when they fell behind the first time. That was right after his company folded and he was between gigs. I helped without hesitation. That was just what we did, or so I thought. Our family had this unspoken rule. We look out for each other, even if that means biting your tongue and picking up the slack sometimes. I had a stable job, no kids, no mortgage of my own, and when my parents passed a few years ago, I inherited their savings. I didn't mind being the one who had her act together, the one everyone could lean on. Not until leaning became a full-body press that pinned me under expectations I never agreed to carry. That night, it was just after Thanksgiving. The kids were already sugared up and zoned out in front of some animated movie, and the adults were half-heartedly passing around leftover containers and holiday schedules. Ethan's wife Claire had done her usual, "So glad you came, Maggie" speech, all while pretending not to notice that I'd brought 3 homemade side dishes, a pie, and enough wine for a small wedding. I was used to being invisible in their home, a well-fed ghost who helped clean up and left quietly when the dishes were done. We were in his kitchen, just the two of us. He was wiping down the counters in that unnecessarily aggressive way men do when they're avoiding a subject. And I mentioned almost casually that I was thinking about halting the mortgage support. I wasn't trying to blindside him. I even softened it, told him I'd give him a month or 2 more. Just needed to refocus some things for myself. You know what he did? He stopped mid-wipe, set the rag down, turned toward me like he was about to give a eulogy, and delivered that line. "No one wants you at Christmas this year." I think he expected me to snap, to beg or lash out, or maybe apologize for even thinking of stepping back. But I just stared at him, felt something harden inside my chest like a stone clicking into place. I nodded, picked up my coat from the chair, and walked out without another word. In the car, the silence was so thick I could almost hear my own pulse. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't even turn on the radio. I just drove, straight home, unlocked the dusty file where I'd saved his loan documents from last year, and opened up my bank's auto-pay dashboard. 2 clicks later, the payments stopped. You have to understand, I didn't do it to be dramatic. I did it because I realized, in that moment, that helping him was no longer about family. It was about control, about him keeping me tethered to his life, always obligated, never appreciated. That line, it wasn't just mean, it was surgical. It cut right into every insecurity I'd buried under casseroles and Christmas bows for years. I didn't have kids, I didn't have a spouse, I didn't have a reason to be needed by anyone except the people I had been helping out of guilt. I had never really thought about the money I was sending. It was just part of the routine, part of keeping the machine running. But when you hear something like that, it makes you stop and tally the cost, and not just the dollar kind. The emotional tax of being the single one, the dependable one, the invisible one. I could have cut him off immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I gave him just enough rope to trip over. I knew the mortgage company would be reaching out soon. I knew they'd be confused why the dependable payment suddenly dried up. And I knew Ethan would panic. Because when people like him lose control, they don't just stumble, they spiral. As I sat on my couch that night, curled up with a glass of wine and a worn-out blanket, I couldn't help but picture him in his pristine, overpriced kitchen, checking his banking app, realizing the money wasn't coming. I could almost hear the click of confusion turning into frustration, followed by the slow burn of dread. That thought didn't comfort me, not really, but it did keep me warm. What came next wasn't planned. I hadn't set out to ruin his life, not at first. But once the cracks started showing, once I saw how fragile his perfect little world really was, I couldn't stop myself from pressing a little harder. And the best part? He still had no idea I'd pulled the plug. 3 weeks later, Claire left me a voicemail. She was crying. The voicemail came on a Tuesday afternoon, somewhere between my third cup of coffee and the unremarkable clatter of keys and invoices that made up the slow pulse of the small logistics firm I ran from my home office. I hadn't expected anything unusual, just the usual telemarketer pitches, and maybe a reminder from my dentist that I was overdue for a cleaning. But the moment I heard Claire's voice, tight with a trembling panic she didn't even bother to hide, the room seemed to shrink around me. I stopped everything, held the phone closer to my ear, and let her words spill into my quiet space like water through cracked drywall. "Maggie," she whispered, as though someone might overhear her even through the recording. "I don't know what's going on." The mortgage company called again. They said the payment stopped weeks ago, and Ethan keeps telling me it's handled, but it's not. We're behind, really behind. And I don't know who else to call. Please, if you know anything, just call me back. She didn't cry the whole way through. Claire was never the weepy type. But her voice cracked in that way where you could tell she'd been holding it together for too long, pretending everything was fine until her nerves frayed at the edges. I didn't call her back. Not right away. I just sat there, listening to it again, and then one more time, as if trying to decode the exact moment her composure slipped and reality caught up with her. That voicemail did something to me, though not what I would have expected. It didn't feel like vindication, even though part of me had imagined Ethan's life unraveling as some kind of karmic retribution. Instead, it felt like someone had cracked open a door I'd tried very hard to seal shut, one labeled complications, right next to the one marked family drama I didn't sign up for. And even though I had chosen to sabotage his financial lifeline, it hit me, uncomfortably hard, that Claire had never been the one holding the scissors. For days, I didn't respond. I carried that message in my pocket, replaying it like some sick talisman, unsure if I was supposed to feel guilty, triumphant, or simply vindicated. I went about my life, groceries, email, a haircut I was overdue for, and everywhere I turned, her voice hovered like fog. At night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if Claire had ever known just how much of their suburban stability was bankrolled by the sister-in-law no one really wanted around during the holidays. I finally broke when I caught myself typing her number into my phone before I'd even realized I was doing it. I didn't call, just hovered over the digits for a long time, trying to figure out what I'd even say. "I'm the reason you might lose your house." Didn't quite roll off the tongue. And yet, that was the truth, at least on paper. But then again, wasn't it Ethan who'd told me, clear as day, that I wasn't welcome? Wasn't it Ethan who'd let me carry his mortgage in silence and then acted like he was doing me a favor by letting me sit at his table? Out of curiosity, or maybe pettiness, I won't pretend I know the difference anymore. I logged into the old email address I used for our banking correspondence, the one I hadn't touched in months, and sure enough, there they were, the mortgage company's escalating notices. Payment missed, second payment missed, third payment due within 7 days to avoid default. I read every word with a sort of clinical detachment, as though it were a stranger's life unraveling, not the brother who used to chase me around the yard with garden hoses or sit next to me in waiting rooms when I was sick and scared. The thought hit me, what if Claire really didn't know? What if she had no idea just how fragile their finances had become, or how long Ethan had been playing house on borrowed money and borrowed time? That curiosity turned into something more obsessive. I dug through old texts, old conversations, old receipts. The more I looked, the clearer it became. There were holes in their story, inconsistencies in the timeline. I remembered a phone call last spring. Ethan saying they'd finally gotten things under control, and now I wondered if that had ever been true. It was too neat, too clean. And that's when the bigger picture began to emerge. I realized that Ethan had taken out a second mortgage without telling Claire. It wasn't hard to find, not when you knew where to look. Public records, loan databases, and just a few clicks into a county website revealed a lien from some financial services company I'd never heard of, signed with a digital signature that reeked of desperation. It was from a guy named Travis, an old fraternity buddy Ethan once swore off because, and I quote, he plays fast and loose with other people's money. And there it was, the hidden loan, the unpaid primary mortgage, and the quiet unraveling of a man who had built his house of cards on top of my goodwill. I didn't cry, I didn't even flinch. I just sat there at my desk, staring at my monitor, realizing that I held all the strings now, even if no one knew it but me. I thought about calling Claire, telling her everything, but part of me wanted to wait, to see how long it would take for Ethan to confess, to see if he would try to spin it, bury it, or drag her down with him. I wasn't angry anymore, not in that hot, pulsing way that had driven me to cancel the payments. This was something colder, sharper, a quiet patience like a snake coiled under dry leaves, waiting. So I waited, I said nothing, and I watched. By the time the week rolled over into another cycle of grocery runs, calendar updates, and an inbox full of unremarkable requests, I had begun to accept a quiet truth I hadn't fully acknowledged before. That what had started as a gut reaction, a justified if emotionally charged decision to stop funding my brother's fantasy life, had spiraled into something much larger and now stood teetering on the brink of irreversible damage. It was somewhere in the low hum of a sleepless night, while the soft flicker of the hallway light danced along my living room walls, that the realization hit me with a weight I couldn't ignore. By pulling the plug on those mortgage payments, I hadn't just created a financial inconvenience or caused a few tense conversations behind closed doors. I had, whether I meant to or not, shoved them hard enough that they landed in the arms of a predatory lender with one foot planted firmly in Ethan's old frat boy past, and the other in the murky, paperwork-light world of short-term, high-interest panic loans. Travis wasn't a stranger to me, though I hadn't heard his name in years. I remembered him from a handful of family barbecues back in the late 90s, the kind of guy who always wore mirrored sunglasses no matter how cloudy it was, and who spoke in loud, broad strokes about investment opportunities and leveraging debt, like he was giving a TED Talk to an audience of Wall Street executives instead of standing around a plastic patio table holding a beer can wrapped in a koozie shaped like a bikini. Ethan had distanced himself from Travis after a particularly messy fallout involving a shared condo investment in Phoenix. That went sideways, but I suppose desperation has a way of making old contacts look appealing again, especially when all the respectable avenues have dried up and the house you swore you had under control is about to be snatched out from under you. What struck me as I pieced it all together, combing through the paper trail of public lien filings and back-end financial records, was not just the extent of Ethan's deception, but the sheer recklessness of it. The second mortgage, taken out just over 6 weeks after I canceled the autopay, was structured in a way that screamed panic. Short repayment terms, ballooning interest, vague collateral clauses that seemed intentionally confusing, and Travis's name scribbled across the contract like a greasy signature on a bad check. It wasn't a lifeline, it was a noose dressed up in legalese. I sat with that knowledge for longer than I should have, unsure whether to act, to intervene, or to simply let the consequences unfold the way natural consequences often do, swiftly, painfully, and without apology. Part of me, the part that had spent years being overlooked, downplayed, and reduced to a name on a check stub, wanted to do nothing. That part wanted to let the house go under, to let Ethan face the music in the only language he seemed to understand, financial fallout. But another part, deeper and more complicated, couldn't stop thinking about Claire, about the quiet panic in her voice, about the way her concern hadn't sounded performative or strategic, but raw, real, and heartbreakingly human. So I did what any overthinker with a bank account and a mild taste for revenge might do. I started to lay the groundwork for something that would feel less like justice and more like a balancing of scales. I didn't confront Ethan, not yet. Instead, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in over 2 years, Travis's, pulled from an old email Ethan had once CC'd me on, back when they were trying to set up a family vacation rental plan that never came to be. To my surprise, Travis answered on the second ring, his voice as smug and performatively friendly as I remembered. I didn't tell him who I was at first, just asked some vague questions about private lending, pretended I was doing research for a friend, and let him talk himself into a full sales pitch before dropping the name of the property he'd leaned. Watching as the tone of his voice shifted from entrepreneurial enthusiasm to cautious curiosity. Once he knew who I was, he tried to pivot, talked about confidentiality, how he wasn't at liberty to discuss the specifics of client arrangements, but I could hear the unease creeping in. He knew he was dealing with someone who had both information and intent, and I made sure to sound calm, rational, even a little bored, as I asked what it would take to move the debt up for early repayment or reassignment. "What's your angle here, Maggie?" he finally asked. And I didn't answer, not because I didn't have one, but because giving it voice felt too close to admitting I was no longer the bystander in this mess, but the architect of its next phase. By the end of that call, I had what I needed: terms, amounts, a rough timeline, and more importantly, a confirmation that the loan was callable under certain conditions. Conditions I could engineer if I pushed just the right buttons at just the right time. I didn't intend to pull the trigger immediately. This wasn't about panic. It was about pressure. A slow turn of the screw. Ethan had spent years building a life that looked impressive from the outside: gleaming countertops, curated holiday photos, polite laughter at family events. But now the veneer was cracking, and for the first time, I was seeing the framework underneath. And what I saw wasn't strong, wasn't stable. It was cobbled together from pride, pretense, and debt he couldn't manage without someone else quietly shouldering the load. I wasn't ready to confront him yet. That would come. But for now, I was content to watch the balance tip, one quiet act at a time. Because when you stop being the invisible sister and start being the one with leverage, people begin to look at you differently, and eventually they start knocking on your door. It was one of those late December evenings that made the entire street seem frozen in time, not because of the snow, there was none that night, but because of the stillness, the thick winter air that clung to every breath like wool, and the way the Christmas lights, tired and flickering on every porch from years of reuse, blinked out of rhythm like a fading heartbeat. I had just finished folding a basket of laundry, still warm against my forearms, when the knock came, soft, hesitant, and yet unmistakably urgent. The kind of knock that doesn't announce itself as polite or neighborly, but instead feels like a cry for help wrapped in the thinnest layer of pride someone can manage to hold on to when everything else is falling apart. I opened the door, already knowing who I would find on the other side. There was no question in my mind, no moment of suspense or surprise, just the quiet, inevitable confirmation that Claire, wrapped in a too-light jacket and gripping her oversized purse like it was a lifeline, had reached the end of a rope I had been steadily unraveling for weeks. Her eyes, wide and red-rimmed, searched mine not with the hostility I might have expected after everything, but with something much more devastating: relief, shaded heavily with embarrassment, the kind of expression worn by someone who never thought they'd be here, standing on a doorstep they once considered beneath them, asking for help from someone they never quite treated as real. "Maggie," she said, voice catching on the cold air, like it wasn't used to speaking outside of tightly controlled environments. I didn't know where else to go. I stepped aside without a word, gesturing her in with a slight nod, and she moved past me like someone walking into a church they hadn't visited since childhood, quiet, reverent, and unsure if they still belonged. She settled onto the edge of my couch, her posture upright and stiff, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And for a long moment, we said nothing. Just let the sound of my old heater rattling in the vent fill the room like awkward conversation neither of us wanted to initiate. "I'm sorry to show up like this," she began finally, her voice thin and frayed at the edges. "But I found out about the loan, about Travis, about the mortgage, and I thought, maybe you knew something, or maybe you could tell me what I don't know, because Ethan—" She trailed off, her mouth forming the rest of the sentence silently, as if to say his name too many times would make something crack open inside her that she wasn't sure she could put back together. I didn't respond right away, didn't leap into the confession I had rehearsed a dozen times in my head during the week since the voicemail. I watched her instead, really watched her, the way her fingers tightened and untightened, the slight tremble in her knee, the way her eyes darted toward my fireplace, like she was afraid I might explode at any moment and she needed to know her escape route. And for the first time since this entire mess began, I didn't feel superior or vindicated or even in control. I just felt tired. Tired of the weight of other people's expectations. Tired of the silence I had chosen. And tired of being the only one willing to admit that the truth had a sharp edge and no one had come away from it uncut. "He didn't tell you," I said finally, not a question, just a flat observation. And she shook her head slowly, her lips parting just enough to let out a long, shaking breath. "No," she whispered. "He said things were fine, that we were catching up, that work would pick up again in the new year." And I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him because what kind of wife doesn't trust her husband? But then I found the emails, the missed notices, and when I asked him, really asked him, he told me it was my fault for stressing him out. That if I hadn't pushed him about the holidays or the budget or any of it, then we'd be fine. And I couldn't take it anymore. Her voice broke on that last word, and for a moment she didn't speak. Just pressed her lips together so hard they went white, like she could physically will herself not to cry in front of me. And I felt something shift. Not quite forgiveness, not yet, but an understanding maybe, that we were both victims of the same storm, just caught on different sides of the wreckage. "I can help," I said, the words surprising even me with their clarity. "But not like before, not quietly, not in the background where no one sees. If I do this, if I get you out from under Travis's thumb and keep the house out of foreclosure, you both have to show up. Ethan has to sit down with me, with you, on Christmas Eve and explain everything. No excuses, no stories, just the truth." Claire blinked at me, her expression frozen in a mixture of hope and fear and something else. Maybe guilt, or maybe just disbelief that I would still offer a hand after everything they had said. Everything they hadn't said. "I'll talk to him," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I'll make sure he's there." And with that, she stood, still clutching her purse like it might fall apart if she let go, and walked back out into the cold. I didn't offer a hug, didn't pretend we were friends, but I watched her go, watched her shoulders straighten as she stepped off my porch, and I felt the first tremor of something bigger than revenge. Because I had done what I set out to do. I had turned the screws, watched the facade crack, but now, with the pieces scattered and fragile at my feet, I had to decide what came next. And as I stared at the empty street, the winter wind curling around my ankles, my phone lit up on the end table behind me, Ethan's name glowing bright against the darkness, calling me for the first time in months. Christmas Eve was coming. And so was the reckoning. The town's coffee shop, which had been dressed up in its best attempt at festive cheer with tired garlands, overused red bows, and a fake pine wreath hung too low on the front door, smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon syrup that had been spilled and never quite cleaned up, the kind of scent that lingered no matter the season. Though it felt particularly out of place when layered over the weight of what was about to unfold. I had chosen it because it was public enough to keep the conversation civil, but quiet enough that every word, every hesitation, and every deflection would ring loud between us. And as I sat there at the corner table near the fogged-up window, watching the steam rise from the mug I hadn't touched, I couldn't help but think about how surreal it was that a moment so heavy could arrive in a place so bland, how the turning point in a family saga spanning decades might be bookended by bad lattes and jingles playing too loud from an old speaker by the counter. Ethan was late, not dramatically, but just enough to remind me of every time he'd walked into a room on his own terms, expecting the world to adjust its rhythm to his arrival. And when he finally came in, bundled in a coat that looked more expensive than his situation should have allowed, he moved toward the table with that same mix of hesitation and entitlement I had come to associate with people who had never really suffered consequences that stuck. He didn't greet me. He just pulled out the chair, slid into it like we were negotiating a contract instead of sitting across from years of resentment and unspoken betrayals. And for a long moment, we simply looked at each other, the air between us thick with everything we'd never said. "I figured you'd gloat," he said eventually, not quite meeting my eyes, his fingers tapping in a regular rhythm on the edge of the table, a nervous habit he'd picked up somewhere in his 20s when confidence alone stopped solving his problems. "Figured you'd want to rub it in." I didn't answer right away, partly because I wanted him to feel the discomfort of the silence, but mostly because I had learned over time that letting someone fill their own silence often revealed more than any question ever could. And sure enough, he kept going, his voice slipping into that familiar defensive rhythm that tried to frame every poor decision as an unfortunate necessity, every omission as a kindness, every betrayal as a misunderstood sacrifice. "I didn't tell Claire because I thought I could fix it," he continued, and now he was looking at me, his expression tight with a mix of shame and stubborn pride. "I didn't want to worry her, and yeah, maybe I took the loan from Travis too fast, but you pulled the rug out without warning. You didn't even talk to me." "You told me no one wanted me at Christmas," I said finally, my voice calm in the way that only comes when anger has burned down to embers. "You made it very clear I wasn't welcome, and yet you were still taking my money." He flinched, just barely, and for the first time, I saw something like understanding in his eyes. Not regret, not yet, but the beginnings of recognition. The slow, painful awareness that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't overreacted, hadn't overstepped, but had finally decided that being family didn't mean being disposable. "I was angry, Quas," he said, and now the words were slower, heavier. "I was angry and stupid, and I took you for granted. I thought you'd always be there." That was the moment. Not the apology itself, because it wasn't quite that, but the crack in his voice when he said always, like he was only just realizing that always had an expiration date, that the safety net he had assumed would never tear had already unraveled and slipped away, quietly, without fanfare. I didn't need a grand gesture. I didn't need him to cry or beg or fall to his knees in a dramatic display of remorse. I just needed to know he knew. And in that moment, I did. Claire arrived a few minutes later, her presence softening the tension like a warm coat thrown over a cold chair. She greeted me with a quiet, thankful nod, took Ethan's hand under the table in a gesture that was equal parts support and silent accountability, and when she spoke, it was with the steady, deliberate tone of someone who had spent the last several nights sleeping beside a stranger she still loved but no longer recognized. "We want to fix this," she said, and she meant both the finances and the fractures between us. Though we all understood that some debts can't be paid with money and some wounds can't be closed with apologies. "But we can't do it without you." I told them I had already contacted Travis, arranged to absorb the second mortgage under conditions that would stabilize their payments and prevent foreclosure, and while Ethan looked momentarily relieved, he didn't smile because he knew it wasn't a gift. It was a transaction, not in dollars, but in truth, in accountability, in trust that would take years to rebuild, if it ever did. "I'm not your safety net anymore," I said, looking at Ethan, but including Claire in the gravity of the moment. "If you want help, you'll ask for it the right way. You'll tell the truth, and you'll stop pretending everything's fine while other people carry your weight." He nodded slowly, the way someone nods when the truth is finally heavier than their pride. And for the first time in years, I believed he might actually mean it. We didn't hug, we didn't cry, we didn't turn the coffee shop into some cathartic Hallmark movie ending. We simply sat for a while, sipping lukewarm drinks in a space filled more with silence than conversation. But this silence wasn't heavy. It was new, and that felt like something. When we left, I didn't walk them out. I watched them go from my seat by the window, their figures small against the gray of the evening, and I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. Not really, I wasn't bitter, I wasn't vindicated. I was just free. I didn't send a Christmas card that year. I didn't show up with pies or casseroles. I didn't put myself back in a place where I wasn't seen. But I also didn't shut the door all the way. Because sometimes revenge isn't about burning bridges. Sometimes it's about building one that only the truly repentant will ever bother to cross. And maybe, just maybe, they will. Or maybe they won't. Either way, this year, I finally had a Christmas that was mine. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.